everyone. My name is David Brockman. I'm an associate professor of political science here at Berkeley, as well as one of the faculty on the faculty executive committee, I think we're called, of the Citrin Center for Public Opinion Research here at Berkeley. And so today's panel is about why, or if at all, Democrats are losing the Latino vote. And just to say a little bit about this, I think if 10 or 20 years ago, at least for those of you in the room who have been following politics that long, we have some undergrads here who probably weren't thinking about politics at that point. But if you rewind maybe 10 or 20 years ago, there was, I think, a pretty common view that Democrats were sort of on track to get this sort of just permanent dividend from all of these Hispanic voters that were both growing in number and were trending towards the Democratic Party. So the thought was there's this kind of wind at Democrats back, a national election of democratic change, and this group of Latino voters that was growing more influential. And there's also the view, basically exactly a decade ago, that the Republican Party would actually need to moderate, especially on the issue of immigration, in response to this. And so there was a big report after, I believe, the 2012 election, where Republicans said, well, what can we do? We probably need to accommodate Latino voters more in order to win some of these votes. And I think now a lot of that conventional wisdom from 10 years ago is all very much in question. So if you look at for example, the New York Times has a nice handy map where you can look at changes between 2016 and 2020. There's a lot of the places that shifted most heavily to the right are very heavily Latino areas. So for example, Starr County, Texas, 96% Hispanic, and South Texas moved 55 points towards Republicans between 2016 and 2020. So that means 1 in 4 people changed their votes. Miami-Dade County moved 22 points more Republican between 2016 and 2020, just these huge swings. Here in California, we have an institute on campus, the Institute for Governmental Studies, that runs surveys every month called the IGS polls. And in the recent Berkeley IGS polls, you see that Hispanics and Latinos in California tend to prioritize kind of kitchen table issues like housing affordability, and that fewer white voters prioritize those issues. And that actually exactly 12% of both white and Latino voters in the recent surveys name immigration as the most important issue. So really kind of defying what I think a lot of that 10 to 20-year-old conventional wisdom sort of thought. Likewise, in April 2020, our IGS poll found that, at least in California, Latino voters were no more supportive than white voters of Biden's performance in office. And we think about why some of these signs of increasing Latino support for Republicans, it's not exactly clear that that's because Republicans are getting more moderate on immigration, which is what I think the wisdom 10 years ago thought like would have to happen. So not everyone kind of agrees with this sense of what's happening, and definitely I think there's not a lot of agreement about why, but I think this is an important question to talk about. So I'm really excited to have this kind of star-studded panel today of folks to come speak with us. So I'll just go in the order that they're sitting here in the room for everyone's clarity. So the first we have Anais Lopez, who's a senior analyst at BSP, which is one of the premier polling firms of Latino voters in the US. She's an expert on messaging and polling of Latino voters in both kind of more quantitative polling and focus group with a special focus on young voters. We have Mike Madrid, who is one of the co-founders of the Lincoln Project and is also a partner at Grassroots Lab and is one of the, I think, most experienced Republican political consultants here in California. We have next Amanda Iovino, who is a vice president at WPA Intelligence and was also a director of polling and data for the Youngkin for Governor campaign, the Republican gubernatorial campaign in Virginia, which won an upset victory last year. And last, we have David Shore, who's the head of data science at Blue Rose Research. Ezra Klein recently said that David was, quote, telling Democrats what they don't want to hear, and that Obama is known for posting his analysis on Twitter. So we have a lot of different folks here with different perspectives. What I'm going to do is give a max of 15 minutes to each person. I'll give you all a 2-minute warning when you're up close to the end of your 15 minutes. And then at the end, we'll have time for some audience questions. So with that, I'll turn it over to Anais. Well, and one last thing while we're setting up here, I want to do a quick plug. The Citrin Center has one other event coming up on April 29th, when we're going to have John Sides here, who is a real expert in presidential elections, and he's going to be here to give a talk about the 2020 presidential campaign. So you can find that on the Citrin Center website, April 29th at 3:30 p.m. Okay, with that, I'll turn it over to Anais.
Perfect. Okay, thank you. Hi, everyone. So As mentioned, my name is Anais Lopez. I'm a senior analyst at BSP Research. So we're here to answer the question, who's winning the Latino vote? What does that mean? Is there a Latino vote? And what is the future of the Latino electorate? We're going to go through four main topics here today. First, we're going to understand what happened in 2020, or we're going to try to at least. We're going to talk about the rhetoric around the Latino electorate and what we can look for in the future. We're going to talk about the complexity, the diversity, and the formation of identity politics among Latinos, the demographic realities of Latino voters, who they are, and what impact they will have in the future, and then the issues that they actually care about. So let's start by level setting the 2020 election. There are many misconceptions about Latinos following the 2020 election. It was a record year for Latino voters. They grew by almost 30%. Relative to the national electorate, that was only half of that. But there was a lot of media surrounding Florida and Latinos in the state. It is important to note that Florida was the first big Latino state to release their data and have their exit polls shown. And yes, Trump did make inroads in the state. But the Latino vote was decisive across the country. If Arizona had been the first state to release their polls, we would have probably seen rhetoric very different than we saw. It would have reported that massive Latinos came to help Biden win the presidential election. So while there was a 7 to 10 point shift towards Trump in 2020, Biden still won Latinos by a very large margin. In 2020, we also had the ever-present reality of the COVID-19 pandemic. There we go. Back in 2016, Trump attacked Latinos harshly. He had anti-immigrant rhetoric. He called Mexicans rapists. And then in 2018, he had kids in cages at the US-Mexico border. So what changed in 2020? He stopped talking about immigrants and Mexicans and Central Americans and started talking about reopening the economy. In 2016, Latinos cared about racial discrimination. And in 2020, they were worried about going back to work because they were disproportionately affected by the economic impacts of the COVID-19 pandemic. So even if Latinos disliked Trump, he was still seen as fighting to reopen the economy. So what are Latinos really? How complex and diverse are they? Unlike Blacks and African Americans, who generally have a degree of linked fate, which means they can trace their history back to racism, discrimination, the slave trade, Latinos are incredibly diverse. And one way in which this is shown is through their political identification. 1 in 3 Latinos register as Republicans and they identify as Republican. We can understand the ways that Latinos create their political identification with 2 things: perceived discrimination and their ethnic identity. The more Latinos identify with their ethnicity, the more they feel united as Latinos, and the more they perceive discrimination against them, the more they see it as a major issue in society. So what are the demographic realities of Latino voters in the United States? This map shows the increase in population across the United States. In 2020, there were over 65 million Latinos in the United States. And while we know that there are large populations in California, Texas, New Mexico, we see them emerging across the country. In Pennsylvania and Georgia, Latinos played a significant role in Black-led multiracial coalitions that helped Democrats win margins in the 2020 presidential and in the Senate runoffs. And this trend is bound to continue. As mentioned, there were 65 million Latinos in 2020, And the US Census predicts that by 2060, there will be 111 million Latinos in the United States. They will make up nearly 30% of the American electorate. So why is it moving so fast? Well, Latinos are young. We look at the largest 5-year age cohort of whites, we see that it's 50 to 54. We look at the largest 5-year cohort of Latinos, it is 0 to 5. Half of the entire Latino population is younger than 29. So earlier I asked, what does the Latino vote mean? And does it exist? Well, I would say that there are Latino voters, but there is no such thing as, quote, the Latino vote. Latinos have always been diverse in their political ideologies, and they range across the spectrum. But they do have this sense of commonality. They do share experience of discrimination, immigrant experiences, and the reality of being Latino in the United States. And so when we seek to examine Latinos, both conservative and liberal, we must ensure that the data reflects the demographic to be understood in the role, with the role of Latinidad in place. But overall, Latinos are feeling tokenized. And this is by both parties. They are becoming increasingly critical of what politicians are doing for them. I think there is this misconception that Latinos do not care. But I argue that's not true. Rather, they feel like the parties are making them feel like they shouldn't care, that they are going to be taken advantage of regardless of who they vote for. And so when we talk to Latinos, and especially young Latinos, their response to who they should vote for is, well, what are they doing for me? I want them to convince me to vote for them. So they want not only to vote, but they want to vote knowing that their vote will make a difference. And finally, what are the issues that Latinos care about? And how are they deciding their vote? Well, they're responding to candidates. There was this notion in 2020 that increased share of Latino voters identified with Republicans. And I think that was mentioned earlier. But I would say this isn't true. We've already said that 1 in 3 Latinos identify as Republican. In 2004, Bush garnered 38% of the Latino vote. But then in 2012, Obama was able to secure 75%. In 2020, Trump made gains, but only because he really underperformed in 2016 with his anti-Latino rhetoric. And so looking forward at the 2022 election, it will be about stabilizing the economy. When we talk to Latinos today, and we ask them what are the issues facing their community, facing the country, rising costs, gas, inflation, that is what comes to mind to them. Many lost their jobs during the pandemic. Many had less than $500 in savings at the time, and they were dependent on the stimulus checks. And work from home wasn't an option. As they get back to work, it continues to not be an option for many. The Biden administration has overseen record job growth and low unemployment, but it will be up to the Biden administration to make sure that they get this message to the voters and make them feel that the economy is stabilized post-COVID-19. Across the board, we see that Latinos agree with the Democrat agenda, whether it is a path to citizenship for undocumented immigrants, passing new voting rights laws, or a $3,000 child tax credit. Here, we polled all Latinos, regardless of political party. And you can see that they support the Democrat agenda across the board. But they are not informed as to what the Democrat agenda is. When we ask them what do Republicans and what do Democrats stand for, they tend to give the same 3 answers over and over again. And then we probe them, and they actually agree with the Democrats. So mobilization will really be the defining factor in 2022. Unlike other racial groups whose parents tend to encourage their kids to go out and vote, it is young Latinos that encourage their parents to vote. If they are not mobilized, they will not mobilize others. About 1 in 5 Latinos are first-time voters every single election. In 2020, the largest share of voters in the Latino electorate were first-time voters, but the second largest share were second-time voters who had voted for the first time in 2018. So, who is winning the Latino vote? Well, George W. Bush and Reagan did well among Latinos, and then so did Obama. And then again in 2020, so did Trump. In 2016, there was the anti-immigrant rhetoric, but in 2020, it was about the economy. When a party is not in charge, we know that they're able to take advantage of the bad media that is surrounding the party, the incumbent party. That worked in favor for the Democrats in 2020 and will likely work against them in the next 2 elections. Yes, there was a 10% shift towards Trump, but I would be very hesitant to call that a trend. We hope that in 2024, the pandemic will truly be behind us. Half of us here are wearing masks and half are not. So hopefully by then we will have a better sense of what is to come. The economy will hopefully be stabilized and there will be a new playing field for all politicians. So I argue that there really is no such thing as, quote, the Latino vote. But there is a very large, very diverse, very young, and very, very eager to be mobilized Latino electorate waiting to cast their vote. Thank you.
Next up, we have Mike Madrid.
Thank you, and thank you for having me. I was just mentioning to some of the panelists that my son just graduated from Cal a couple of months ago. So it's good to see that some of my tuition money is going to good purpose. I have a unique place, I think, in the story of working with Latino voters, which kind of means I'm a little bit older than most folks. I started out running political campaigns as a Latino specialist in the GOP back in the early 1990s. Was very intimately familiar with the Prop 187 campaign, a defining moment in 1994, which most of you are probably not alive in. And I have to remind myself very regularly that a lot of voters not only have no memory of these really emotionally impactful campaigns that defined a Latino voting bloc where no one existed before, but we're not only do they not have a memory, they weren't even alive. And again, I think it's probably a statement again on how many races I've done. I've also had the unique role of running Antonio Villaraigosa's campaign for governor in the primary, which is odd for a Republican, but as was mentioned in my biography, I'm very much a Lincoln Project Republican, and I've had some very, very strong issues, which were very public with the Republican Party and where it's at, especially as it relates to the tonality in speaking to Latino voters. And I want to spend some time dissecting that. I've also worked as the political director of the California Republican Party, worked for the Republican National Committee. I'm still a Republican and have worked for probably more Republican successful campaigns than any California Republican consultant. So I've seen both sides of the aisle. I've seen how both sides at most of the highest levels of campaigns are operated by Latino operatives, and there's a dearth on both sides of Latino specialists, especially I would argue on the Republican side, which tends to be much more Cuban American, and no offense to my Cuban American brothers and sisters, but it's less than 5% of the national Latino vote electorate, and it's concentrated largely in one pivotal state, which is why there's this really ridiculous Republican overemphasis on the Cubanization of our Hispanicity. There is really, I think, a very easily understandable and describable dynamic that does explain this shift in Republican voting patterns. And I do find it really interesting and accurate to be talking on this panel about why Democrats are losing the Latino vote. You'll notice it's not entitled, "Why are Republicans winning the Hispanic vote?" Those are two very different things. And I think that the framing of this panel is more accurate, because a lot of the shift is happening despite what Republicans are doing, and is caused largely by the ineptitude and lack of awareness of the Democratic Party. Fundamentally, the largest shift that is happening is correlates to the consolidation of educated voters, college-educated voters in the Democratic Party, and the equally rapid consolidation of non-college educated voters in the Republican Party. It's the most definitive dynamic happening in the country today, and it is creating not just two Americas geographically, as we talk about the bluing of urban America and the redifying, is that the right word? The redding, not redding, but the more red coloration that we're seeing in rural America. This education divide is literally creating a big part of the cultural divide that we are witnessing and that we are seeing. Latinos we are the largest and fastest growing segment of the non-college educated workforce in the country. And one of the problems I think that the Democratic Party has had over the course of the past 25, 30 years, as I've been engaged since the mid-1990s here in California, is this belief and this overemphasis on Latino identification with a community that doesn't share that same sentiment. As was mentioned earlier by Anais correctly mentioned that identification, that correlation with identity develops into a more democratic, more left-leaning view of the community and their political perceptions. I think that's absolutely right. The challenge is, if you believe Pew data, which is kind of the gold standard for Latino research and has been for 3 decades, the overwhelming majority of Latinos don't affiliate as anything other than a typical American, and have not, even amongst first-generation Latino, first-generation Hispanics, to the tune of by second or third generation, over 75, 76% of Hispanics don't view themselves as anything other than typical Americans. When you look at a control group like African Americans, you see rapidly, significantly, completely divergent numbers on these questions of race and perception of identity. And so the question that we're really asking as we divide culturally and as we divide economically is, will Latinos acculturate, assimilate, politicize as an aggrieved racial minority, as the Democratic Party messages to them and speaks to them, or will they be more of an emergent, upwardly mobile, economic middle class movement, which seems to be happening particularly outside of California? And I say this because if you're right, Mike, then explain California. How can it possibly be over 30 years, the state with the largest Latino population has probably the most partisan Democratic group constituency anywhere in the country, more than Puerto Ricans in New York, more than really virtually anywhere? And the answer to that is twofold, but I do want to show how significant the California, what I call anomaly, is. As Anais correctly pointed out, Barack Obama hit kind of in recent times a high point. I say recent times because when she's bringing up the George W. Bush campaigns, I was doing those Latino efforts back in 2000, 2004, again, to show you how long I've been doing these. And we were pushing the envelope on the types of numbers we were getting nationally, but the Latino electorate was entirely different 20 years ago. It's moving that fast, as she showed you by other graphics. It's literally changing minute by minute. I think the statistic is a new Latino registers every 30 seconds in this country. And so over 20 years, those numbers add up, particularly in key states. But she did point out quite accurately that Barack Obama got 75% of the Latino Hispanic vote. Do you know what he got in California that same year? 75%. 4 years later, Hillary Clinton runs, and she gets about 67% of the Hispanic vote nationally. Do you know what she got in California? 75%. 4 years later, Joe Biden gets 59% of the Hispanic vote. Do you know what he got in California? 75%. The reason why that's important is because any of the pollsters or demographers in the room will tell you that because California is so Hispanic weighted, that when you do a national sample, you have to have a weighting that reflects the size and proportion of California winning 75% of the vote, meaning That 59% that Joe Biden got is horrible outside of California. And there's one other state that matches California's rigid partisan performance. Any guesses as to what that is? It's Arizona. Arizona. And so there is a California and Arizona exception. And the question is why? Why? And the answer really is twofold for California. I don't know some of the statistics on one point in Arizona, but the bottom line is this. It becomes, I would strongly agree, as somebody who's kind of been involved in these efforts and seen these vote patterns and seen the campaign's practice, it comes from 20 years of anti-immigrant sentiment creating a multi-generational coalition against the Republican Party, not for the Democratic Party. And the name of the panel is very important here. And the reason I say not for the Democratic Party is we have that same 30 years of data showing extraordinarily low turnout levels, which is oftentimes a sign that there is not a compelling political message that Democrats are using to turn out the largest voter base in the entire country. Okay? So it takes, where an ethnic voter base does not exist, the Republicans created one with Pete Wilson and Prop 187, Prop 209, Prop 227, and 20 years of anti-immigrant legislation being introduced by Republicans in California. In Arizona, you had Joe Arpaio, you had Jan Brewer, overtly antagonistic, racist, xenophobic Republicans making the case that Hispanic immigration, legal and illegal, was bad. You had a whole range, a whole slew of anti-immigrant legislation, including racial profiling bills that defined an entire generation of political campaigns and political, a generation of Mexican-American, predominantly Latino, generally, Mexican-American politicians. Texas, at the same time, incidentally, and again, when I was younger, a lot of what I was working on in the Republican Party was, can we be a more aspirational party like the Texas Republican Party of George W. Bush and even Rick Perry? George W. Bush famously said, anybody willing to come across the border in the middle of the desert to work for minimum wage is somebody I want working for in Texas. Rick Perry famously blew up his second presidential campaign in a Republican debate by saying, if you don't support educating undocumented kids in public schools, you don't have a heart. He was booed off stage roundly, and I realized at that moment the Republican Party had changed entirely. Conversely, while Texans were saying this, Californians were running and Arizonans were running anti-immigrant legislation. So the different directions that the Republican Party has taken are very clear, and I would subscribe very strongly to the theory that it's not moderation, that we have always had a third of our Hispanic community that is for stronger border restrictions, always. This goes back to when I was doing focus groups and polling for Governor Wilson back in 1994, when a third of the Latino vote voted for Proposition 187. A third voted for Proposition 187. This is not a new dynamic. The aberration in many cases is the oversampling of California and Arizona. And it's a reflective sample, it's not an oversample of where the Latino community was at that point in time. What we're now witnessing is beyond that and lacking that, and I'll get to the Trump exception in a second, but beyond that and lacking that, are Latinos going to continue to politicize the way so many other aspirational immigrant groups in the past have? And I would suggest, disagree a little bit with Anaisa here, that that is the trend line. And the reason why is there is evidence. It wasn't just 2020. We saw it in the off terms with Youngkin. We saw it in New Jersey. We saw it in Pennsylvania. We saw it in Texas, again in the Rio Grande Valley. We saw it in the state of Washington. But moreover, we're not just seeing it with Latinos. We're seeing a shift of working class African Americans moving to the right. And that same analysis that was talked about in the introduction showed a rightward shift among all immigrant groups of every ethnicity and every race in the country. The New York Times was showing that there is a rightward shift. This is really easily explainable when you understand the consolidation between college and non-college educated voters in their respective parties. And so the over-reliance, and I'll end with this, I'm sorry if I'm going on too long, the over-reliance of white college-educated progressives consolidating in the Democratic Party has created a cultural and economic cul-de-sac that is preventing the Democratic Party from expanding amongst the fastest growing segment of the electorate. Because it is not just economic populism. We have to remember those pocketbook issues matter, but trying to find a government solution is not what Latino workers are looking for. And data is telling us that, and it has for 30 years. This is not new. If you work as a non-college educated worker in the manufacturing space, or in the agricultural space that requires water, or in the construction space, or in the energy space, you view the Democratic Party as an enemy of your interests. You do. And that constituency in the Democratic Party is an inviolable orthodoxy that it will not change. And I'm not suggesting or making any judgment call on whether it's good or bad. A lot of the stuff is based on the environmental movement, which is trying to save the planet, right? Answer bigger questions. I get it. But we also can't deny that working class people increasingly find the Democratic Party openly hostile. That's not Mike Madrid's opinion. That's the opinion and the results of working class voters saying that, not just in polling, but at the voting booth. So the Democratic Party has to understand it is no longer the party of Franklin Delano Roosevelt. It is no longer the party of the working man and woman. And Latinos who do not have as much of an ethnic or racial anchor, who view themselves more white, and let's remember, Hispanicity is an ethnicity, it is not a race. It is white, unless you're not. Understand? Got that? A little complicated. But so that rightward shift, I would argue, isn't necessarily an ideological shift as much as it is simply reflecting the overall characteristics of the exact electorate that we're looking at en masse. And so with that, I'll stop right there, turn it over, and we'll be ready to answer some questions. Thanks.
Timing, thank you. All right. So next we have Amanda Iovino. Let me just get your slides up here. There we go. Ooh.
Hi, everybody. Thanks for having me. Two things, I guess, as we kind of start. I'm going to kind of go a different direction than Mike did. And when I got the prompt, I was thinking about the panel title. I really did want to look at not necessarily why are Democrats losing, but why are Republicans gaining? What have we been doing since that autopsy report in 2013 that has really kind of helped build a foundation so that Republican candidates now can kind of take advantage of the issue set moving our way with Latino voters. And also just kind of for the next 15 minutes, let's not talk about Donald Trump. I think whenever he enters the conversation, he just kind of steals the spotlight, and that's all you can talk about and think about. But there's been a lot of work that's been going on the right that is kind of happening before him, kind of while he was president, and then in this post will he or won't he kind of era. So first thing is acknowledging that Republicans have an issue. And there have been a number of these kind of reports over the years about the need for Republicans to better communicate and have better outreach with Hispanic voters. And Mike's talking about this a little bit. And it's not, again, this 2012 autopsy was not the first indication that we have an issue, but as poorly as Romney did with Hispanics, we knew that there needed to be a change. This is a couple of excerpts from that report talking about whether we have to moderate, or at least our rhetoric has to moderate if our issue position didn't on the issue of immigration. And then also highlighting the diversity that is within the Republican Party and making sure that Hispanic operatives and Hispanic candidates are kind of front and center on issues, including but not just limited to immigration. So first of all, I'm going to just point out that you have a nice crash course, and exit polls are wildly different and tell different stories in different years. So the ones that I was looking at in 2004 had 44% Republican vote share among Hispanics nationwide. And at that point, you can kind of say, okay, what can we do to potentially win with Hispanics? Like not just get a vote share, but kind of win with them overall. And then you hit 2008 and you hit 2012 and kind of plummet and hit hopefully bottoming out of where we were with these voters. And at that point, no series operative can turn around and say, okay, we started with 27%, now we're going to win Hispanics. Now, the movement has to be on the margins, right? Small gains can make big impacts with, especially in down ballot races. I mean, you're talking about state house, state legislature races, congressional races, and moving up. The other part of the autopsy that I think really matters when we're talking about Latino voters is some of the party infrastructure that we built post 2012. And the biggest thing was on the data side. After 2012, we got our butts kicked by the Obama data program. And we knew we had to do something. So instead of having it housed within a Republican presidential candidate, we kind of put it on the outside. It's now part of the party infrastructure. It's called data trust. It provides data and keeps the voter file and cleans it, improves on it to all Republicans on a top down. And from that base, that means it doesn't kind of explode when we have a good presidential candidate, but we also don't have the situation that Hillary ran into, where the Obama campaign had held on to all of the data and didn't necessarily pass it back to the party. So she was left trying to rebuild everything from the ground up. And when you have that kind of cycle, it kind of obliterates your way to have a long-term longitudinal view of your voters. So now that we have data trust, we can find what we call at WPA our Hispanic growth targets. So these are individual voters across the country who are Hispanic and who are either swing voters or who are marginally aligned with the Democratic Party. So we know who these people are as individuals voters, and we can target them and send them messages on digital, all of those annoying text messages that you get from each side. We know who they are, and we can kind of start delivering messages to those. And that's how we start to win at the margins, right? We can collect some voters on either side and start bringing them kind of our way. Next thing I want to talk about is monoliths. And as was said earlier, there's no such thing as a monolithic voting bloc, whether we're talking about Hispanics, women, African Americans, there's no such thing as a monolith in American politics. As Mike said, we've got age, gender, education differences are big cuts that we do to data, no matter what ethnicity we're looking at. But especially with Hispanics, I wanted to point out three kind of additional kind of cuts to the data that you have to look at. One is generation. Mike said, as we're talking about whether someone's a first generation immigrant, second generation, third, and how that plays with their perception of each party and which party has kind of done the best at welcoming them in. And that hasn't always been Republicans, and it's still questionable. The next part is religion, right? Hispanics, you have a large Catholic vote. And if to an individual person, kind of the Catholic pro-life view, if that is the driving factor in their vote, one, Republicans can talk to them a little bit better, and that's also going to make them lean a little bit more right when it comes to the overall their vote. And then on religion, we also have a growing number of evangelical Hispanics, and that's also going to place them more on the Republican side of the aisle and ideologically centered. Country of origin, I kind of talked about a bit here. Obviously, Mexicans are the largest proportion. Republicans have typically done very well with Cuban Americans. We've done well with Venezuelan Americans. Kind of wherever socialism has been tried in real life, those immigrants tend to vote Republican when they get here. But the country of origin really matters when we're talking about, how they perceive different issues like the overall socialism rhetoric and a number of other issues. And kind of already talked about Cubans in Florida and New Jersey. Next thing I want to talk about is messengers. So as part of the autopsy report, we needed to be present in the community when there's not an election happening. It's not rocket science. We actually need to be there and talking to them and making sure that people don't necessarily see us as kind of evil. So we've been growing our outreach efforts into different Hispanic communities. I know the RNC I think they billed last October that they had about 6 or 7 new Hispanic outreach centers across the country. And they're growing those numbers, and it's just community outreach, making sure that we're able to get our message out and meeting people on kind of a one-to-one basis. So you're not just seeing the TV ads. Also being present on Spanish language media. That's something that we had definite trouble with, and with growing the number of Republican consultants who are bilingual. That's been a struggle, but we are kind of but over the last 10 years, we've really been promoting more Spanish speaking operatives kind of getting into higher level positions across the country. And then the more obvious one is ensuring that the face of the party reflects the diversity of the party and the diversity of the country as a whole. This year, these are numbers as of last week, we got 1,482 Republicans are filed for US House races. It's about 400 more than there were this time in 2010, the last wave. 291 are women, 60 more than this time in 2020, when we had a great year for women candidates on the right. And then 246 are from minority communities, and this was 187 at this time in 2020. So we are going out and actively recruiting kind of your not stereotypical Republican candidates. And as we saw in 2020, those were the candidates that won. On the House side, every Republican candidate that won or that flipped a seat was either a woman, a minority, or a veteran. So we were going out and recruiting these. The hardest hurdle that a lot of them face, and it's especially true with women, and is also true with Hispanics, is that the primary across the country is often the hardest hurdle. There's a number of reasons there. Some of it goes from fundraising to stereotypes coming into play. But what we saw in Texas in the primaries is that Latinos, and specifically Latinas, were the story coming out of these runoffs. We've got up to 6 women, depending on how the runoffs go, could be Republican congressional candidates in Texas. So we've done a much better job at recruiting, and there's still a long way to go, but we have been kind of making that effort. And last is messages. And as I was putting this together, Biden's pollster came out with this quote that I thought was perfect. Said, I think that a lot of time this narrative in DC among Democrats is that you only talk to Latinos about immigration. Immigration is a 12th issue that they care about. Guess what? They're concerned about the same things everyone else is. For my Democrat friends, don't worry, Republicans fall into this trap too. It's very common. But if we look at what the issue set is this year, and none of what I'm about to say could be possible if we hadn't built that other foundation, the outreach and the targeting all comes into play now that the issue set is in Republicans' favor. And what do I mean by that? This NRCC poll of Hispanics in battleground states, battleground districts earlier this year, Republicans had a lead on border security. When we're talking about border security as opposed to the immigration topic itself, especially when you're talking about South Texas, border security and the immigration issue generally is more of a public safety issue at this point than it is kind of the way that you think about immigration as an issue. It's what's going on in their communities, and it's everything from property crime to human and drug trafficking. So any sort of unease about the safety of their community, that's coming through in some of the border security conversations. Republicans also have an advantage in crime and public safety, jobs in the economy, and cost of living issues. And inflation is the driving concern of the persuadable vote. It's also one of the top issues that we're talking about in a lot of Republican primaries. And it's not immigration right now, which is probably helping our overall image with Hispanic voters, I think, when it's not necessarily being discussed in primaries. And then the other issue is education and parents wanting to be involved in their kids' education. The 2 years of a pandemic, one, parents finally got to see what was going on in classrooms and what was being taught and how. And that's angered them a lot. And not talking necessarily even about CRT, but just actual curriculum transparency is a big issue with parents. And then there's also the element of teachers' unions made life really hard for parents. Keeping schools closed when the science could send them, when bars are open and schools are closed, it made a very weird picture for parents. And that meant that especially women fell out of the labor force because they couldn't have a predictable work schedule. And that caused more economic concerns, especially when families need 2 incomes in higher inflation years. So there's a lot of issues kind of swirling around in the overall education bucket that are helping kind of bring voters over, whether they're Hispanic or white or Black. So I'm going to just kind of do 2 quick slides about how all of this came into play in Virginia last year. They are a small fraction of the Virginia electorate. We're talking about 6 to 8%, depending on turnout. But the gains that were made by Youngkin and the Republican ticket are, like I said, examples of what we're talking about. First of all, messengers. Virginia has its first Hispanic attorney general, Jason Miyares, Cuban American. We have our first woman of color elected to statewide office with Lieutenant Governor Winsome Sears, and we have Glenn Youngkin. And I was with Glenn from the beginning of the campaign, and he made it a very specific and early focus of the campaign to have grassroots coalition efforts to talk to Latino voters and to not necessarily just talk about Latinos for Youngkin, which was a big banner under our coalition efforts, but we had different outreach efforts for every kind of nation of origin that we were talking about before. The El Salvadorian parties were a lot of fun. And we had those specific outreach efforts, and each of them had their own coalition director, and we were out there and we were present in the communities, and Glenn was out there present in the communities as well. So to that effect, in a similar way, the monoliths, we broke everything down, whether we were talking about Hispanics, we were talking about AAPI, we broke everything out in terms and made sure that we were out there, that there was some effort from the campaign to talk to every specific voter in the way that they wanted to be talked to. And like messages, Glenn was out there talking about eliminating the grocery tax. It's a 2.5% on percent tax on groceries in Virginia. It's not a huge amount of money, but it's a little bit. And it said that Glenn cares about people. And we were actually leading Terry McAuliffe throughout the fall on the issue of cares about people like you. And that's really never been done by a Republican that I've seen in polling. So while he was talking about these issues that mattered, especially to kind of your more blue collar and lower socioeconomic voters, Terry was telling them to get busy and make more Hispanics so that Democrats would have a larger share of the vote. So that just kind of shows you the different way that everyone was communicating to these voters. And so all of that came together to show that margins really matter, right? We won by a little over 60,000 votes. We needed to do well with Hispanic voters, and we improved 10 points over where Trump was in Virginia. Kind of Republicans were sitting in the low 30s. Trump improved in 2020 to 36% with Hispanics in Virginia, and we got 46% of the vote. Again, exit polls, one will tell you that we got about 36%, and the other is going to tell you that we got 56%. This 46% is from our internal tracking data, which we combined and weighted. This is the number that I feel comfortable saying, and I think was accurate. But it is a combination of the messengers, the data targeting that we were able to do, breaking down those monoliths, and the messages that we were delivering to all those voters.
Thank you. So last but not least, we have David Shorts.
All right, I think the mic's working. Okay, thanks so much for having me. Very excited to come out to the West Coast, talk to everyone. The weather is nice. So I'm going to talk about recent trends in the Hispanic vote, some measurement stuff, some data trends, and then at the end, why I think this is happening. So the first thing, you might notice that the previous three people who have given numbers have all given kind of different numbers. And I'm going to give a slightly different set of numbers that may or may not be more accurate. And so the reason why this varies so much is that the polling in 2020 was really, really bad. Like nationally, if you're not talking about Latinos, it was the worst year for polling, I think literally in like 50 or 60 years, which was quite bad up and down the ballot pretty consistently across mode and across pollster. But among Hispanic voters, it was really particularly bad. Basically, I just have kind of two plots over here that probably could have been labeled better. But one is from one of my friends, Jonathan Robinson. He's an analyst at Catalyst. And it shows basically nationscape data, which is like kind of whenever academics kind of talk about and analyze the Hispanic vote, they kind of look at nationscape data. It's like a large 60,000 person online survey. And what it shows is that both in Florida and the US, the nationscape data shows that Hispanics trended toward Democrats from 2016 to 2020 by like 5 to 10 points. When the other graph I have is looking at precinct level election results. So these are precinct level election results in Florida. Every single dot is a precinct that's more than I think 5 or 10% Hispanic. And then the y-axis is showing basically the change in vote share from 2016 to 2020. And what you could see from this is that in Florida, actually, there was probably something like a 14% swing in percentage points. That's nearly 30 points in margin toward Republicans. And so the thing I want to stress is that basically all polling data, and I'm going to be really clear, my polling also heavily underestimated the surge toward Hispanics, but so did everybody else's. We're looking at something like And anyone who tells you otherwise, oh, sorry, I'm gonna pull this slightly more. All right. Anyone who tells you otherwise is like probably exaggerating. Like, I don't think there's a single poll in Florida that even had Hispanics dropping by like more than 1 or 2%, let alone 14. So that's just like an important thing to say, because it's very unfortunate. We had this like once in a generation, subgroup swing. I think this swing is probably the largest swing of any subgroup that was more than 2 or 3% in the last like 30 or 40 years. But unfortunately, all the tools we have to analyze this problem basically don't work. And so that's just something I want to say. It's something that makes it very hard to talk about, is that we really can't use surveys to figure out what happens, maybe a little bit. And so through this, I did my best to mostly, be very skeptical of polls. I'm a pollster, I'm telling you. This in general, this is true in general for Hispanic polling. Generally speaking, Hispanic voters are a lot less likely to answer phone surveys and are a lot less present on online web panels. Even the ones that do answer tend to live in much whiter neighborhoods. They tend to have much whiter surnames. And so there are just very real measurement problems that mean that we should just be kind of skeptical in general whenever people make specific numerical claims. So anyway, so now I'm just going to say, so what actually happened, in 2020? Just in terms, and most of this stuff comes from precinct level election analysis, some done by me, some done by Catalyst, some done by other researchers, and others come from survey data, but we try to use our best judgment. So the first is that Hispanic voters trended about 9% nationwide. That's percentage points. So that's 18 points in margin toward Republicans from 2016 to 2020. In terms of regional variation, that was about 14% in Florida. I want to stress that was not a South Floridian thing. It was not a Cuban thing. There's actually Osceola County as one of the largest concentrations of Puerto Ricans in the US, and it also trended about 14%. It was more than 20% in South Texas. There are counties that have voted consistently Democratic for literally the last 120 years that voted for Donald Trump. And it was somewhat below average in Georgia and Arizona. Though, to be clear, those states trended toward us. If you actually look at how they trended relative to white voters, it is actually relatively similar to the overall national trend. In terms of sub-ethnicity, there is reasonable evidence that Colombian and Venezuelan neighborhoods trended toward Democrats. The example I like to give is Doral, which is very close to where I went to college, FIU. It's a predominantly Colombian Venezuelan neighborhood. Hillary Clinton won it by something like 20 or 30 points. Donald Trump won it by like 30 points as well. So very large swings, but otherwise subgroup differences were fairly muted. If you look nationally, Cubans swung more than the rest of the overall Hispanic population, but that's because they were in Florida. Within Florida, there really weren't very many large sub-ethnicity differences. When it comes to gender, Hispanic women trended considerably more to the right than Hispanic men. This goes against a kind of popular narrative about machismo, of why Hispanic men like Donald Trump. That wasn't true. Hispanic men did not particularly like Donald Trump in terms of swing. That comes from phone surveys. That comes from surveys, to be clear, but that follows a consistent pattern that, generally speaking, in 2020, women trended more toward Donald Trump than men in basically every racial group. There are, the most likely explanation for that is because Hillary Clinton was a woman and Joe Biden was not. But also, women are in general in surveys tend to have, care more about crime. They care more about public safety. And so that also might have been a contributor. When it comes to education, Hispanic voters without a college degree swung more than twice as much as Hispanic voters. The text here is reversed, but Hispanic voters without a college degree swung more than twice as much as Hispanic voters with a college degree. This matches what a lot of the people here have been saying, which is that the education polarization trends, which have hit white voters, also have been true with non-white voters. And I'll talk about this later. I think this is a very important angle for looking at things. Ideology was actually probably the single largest predictor. I have a slide on that later, but basically almost all of the swing among the Hispanic vote was among Hispanics who identify as conservative, which is a very large fraction of Hispanic voters. When it comes to persuasion versus turnout, as someone mentioned here, Hispanic turnout increased by quite a bit. But the thing about those non-voters is that those non-voters, partially because they were disproportionately working class, were a lot more Republican, than Hispanic voters overall. But even among people who voted in both years, Republican Hispanics did have higher turnout than Democratic Hispanics, and that is not a trend that was true for white voters. That said, changes in who voted probably accounted for only about a third of the 9% shift, and 2/3 of it really does seem to be people changing their mind. And then I think the big question mark, and it's a funny thing about this problem and shows there's just some really fundamental questions we don't know, is we really have no idea about the age story. The thing that's kind of hard is that age doesn't really vary that much by precinct. And so it's kind of hard to tease out with ecological analysis. There are, among scholars who like study this stuff, there have been some very heated arguments. There are like some reasons to think that young voters trended more Republican than older voters, just because that's something that happened with African Americans. But there are some precinct results that kind of suggest the other thing, that actually these kind of voters who weren't answering surveys, who are kind of conservative and working class, might have been disproportionately older, and so it's still a big mystery. So I'm just going to say some other important facts. The first is that Hispanic voters also trended against Democrats in 2018 and may have trended against Democrats, at least in battleground states, in 2016. If you look in Florida, the single biggest predictor of 2016 to 2020 swing was actually 2016 to 2018 swing. That's the underrated thing I think about 2018 that nobody talks about, is that Democrats, generally speaking, did a lot better with white voters, but did considerably worse with non-white voters. And that wasn't just a thing. That wasn't just true of Hispanic voters. It was also true of African-American voters. You know, Senator Nelson, when he was running in Florida, he actually did substantially better with white voters, with working class white voters, and even with rural white voters than Hillary Clinton did, but did nearly 14% worse with Puerto Rican voters. I don't have the overall Hispanic number in my head, but that is actually the reason he lost. You know, when it comes to African-Americans, if Stacey Abrams did actually worse than Hillary Clinton in 2018, and had she not, she would have won. So it's an underappreciated trend. And I see 2020 as basically an extension of that trend. The fact that these two trends kind of follow the same geographic pattern really kind of suggests they have a common cause, and I'll get to that later. The other thing is that since 2020, Hispanics have continued to trend toward Republicans. There have been a couple of different elections. You know, the California recall is basically the only exception. But if you look at things like the Texas local elections, the New Jersey elections, Nassau County elections, the Virginia elections, they all point to Hispanics not just not snapping back, but continuing to get more Republican in relative terms than they were before. And that also shows up in a lot of survey data as well. One thing I want to say is that a lot of people, you know, in my industry claim that the reason why Hispanic voters trended toward Republicans in 2020 was because Donald Trump was an incumbent. He said, you know, maybe Hispanic voters really like incumbents, which I think is like a kind of racist thing to say, but either way, it doesn't really, you know, Joe Biden is the incumbent now. It does not really seem to be helping him. The other thing I'll say is that generally speaking in polling, Hispanic voters tend to have conservative attitudes on both crime and COVID, particularly relative to their partisanship. And then another stat I'll say is that non-voters as a group have gone from being a nearly D+15 group in 2012 to being an R+2 group in 2020, basically because working class people have trended toward Republicans. Non-voters are generally less educated than people who vote. And that's kind of mathematically how that works out. Hispanic non-voters are now a D+5 group, with fewer than 25% of Hispanic non-voters identifying as liberal. And this does kind of put real upper bounds on, you know, the upside to mobilization, particularly mobilization based on highly progressive policy. So now I'm just going to talk a little bit about, you know, given the measurement problems, it's very hard to really say with certainty why this happened. And hopefully, you know, COVID will be gone soon and we'll know more. But I think the thing that I kind of center at, and, you know, just is that the Democratic Party has become much more liberal since 2012. So this is just showing the ideological composition of self-identified Democrats since 2000. And if you go back to 2000, people who identified as very liberal were basically almost equal in number to people who identified as very conservative. And moderates outnumbered liberals among Democratic primary voters, basically 2-to-1. Flash forward to now, basically over the last 4 or 5 years, liberals have for the first time become the dominant faction in the Democratic Party. And, you know, that has had a lot of implications. Now that liberals are the majority of the Democratic primary electorate, the Democratic Party has shifted to the left on a whole bunch of issues, whether it's economic issues, social issues, policing. It doesn't mean they can pass laws to implement what they want, but in terms of rhetoric, there have really been incredible shifts, I think across nearly every issue area relative to 10 years ago. But the thing is that most Hispanic voters do not identify as liberal. So this is just showing ideological identification by presidential vote in 2016 and demographic. And then also, this is three-way ideology. And basically what this is showing is even if you restrict people who voted for Hillary Clinton, white college voters are nearly twice as likely as Hispanic voters to identify as liberal, and half as likely to identify as conservative. And so, I think there's a lot of the basic thing about identifying as liberal is that it's really highly correlated with education and it's highly correlated with religiosity. And the reality is that, most working class people and also most non-white voters are much more religious than white liberals are, and they're much more educated, or much less educated. I think this, I think that one thing that kind of comes out very clearly, like I think that even though this panel is about why Democrats are losing the Latino vote, I don't think it's a coincidence that the two groups of people that we've really lost with are working class white voters over the last 6 years and Hispanic voters. And that those two groups of people also are the groups that are less educated, more religious, and identify much less as being liberal. And so I think and just to kind of put the conclusion, as the Democratic Party has become more liberal, I think it's not surprising that basically what we've seen is that Hispanic conservatives have gone from being a D+10 group to becoming an R+40 group. So that's my theory. We'll find out maybe in a couple of years whether it's right, but thanks for listening to me talk. It's been a pleasure to be here.
Thanks very much. And so we have another just over 15 minutes for audience questions. So with that, I think we have someone who's going to bring around a mic or something. Maybe not. Oh, there we go. Right on cue. Okay, great. So yeah, if you just want to raise your hand and then, there's also some questions from Zoom as well that I might read, but why don't we start with folks in the room? And I think this gentleman had his hand up first. Sure. Oh,
thank you. Hello. Yeah. Well, first off, this was awesome. Can you guys hear me? Okay, perfect.
Well, the folks on Zoom need the. Yeah.
Sorry. Okay. So first off, it's a really cool panel because Mr. Shaw, I literally read about you last week in my Democracy and Global Crisis class. My professor right here, and then Lincoln Project. I love Lincoln Project. I read about it last week too. Incredible stuff, to be honest. But I actually want to talk more about border communities. Myself, I came to the U.S. 6 years ago to the Imperial Valley, which is California, right by the bottom, south. I want to ask you, do you have any interesting data on border communities? Because from what I've seen in internships before with Senator Bengueso and other stuff that I've done, I've seen that those communities are very different from many other communities that you see in any data in the United States, very disproportionately affected in so many issues. So I just want to ask what your data that you have seen on border communities, how it looks different from others.
Having worked with Ben on issues and in San Diego and in Arizona and in Texas, probably most of the border states except for New Mexico, as was pointed out, these are very much viewed as public safety issues, and they always have. And we do find, even in some of the Central Valley cities, when we were focus grouping for Antonio's campaign, and again, this is not new, there's fully a third of immigrants themselves that are voting, legal immigrants, that will say we need to stop all immigration, not undocumented immigration, all immigration. So this is not new. And again, it's been there since at least the early 1990s in California, since I've been looking at the issue. What I think is different is Republicans are finally looking at that issue and saying, and trying to figure out, is there a way I cannot be a jerk when I talk about an issue that people really care about? Because it's a legitimate issue. The framing of open borders is kind of like defunding the police. I don't know if there's anybody who's really for open borders, but when Republicans talk about Democrats being for open borders, it's powerful because the Democrats don't have a policy prescription to respond to. They just kind of take it. And again, I think the orthodoxy of their party doesn't allow them to because of the way they're constituted. So look, a lot of the issues, and I think everybody here pointed out some of those data issues. Crime issues are real. The competition for wages is very real in a lot of these communities. Where there's some resentment. It's not atypical for immigrants of all backgrounds historically to be some of the most stridently anti-immigrant kind of, once I'm here, let's kind of pull up the bridge door. And immigration is not any different, and it hasn't been in the 30 years I've been doing campaigns in border states.
I just want to jump in on that jerk comment because I absolutely think it's true. For Republicans, one of the upsides of having so many women candidates, especially in Texas and especially in border communities, I've done a lot of testing of women candidates, and women can say the same exact immigration rhetoric that a man can, a Republican woman and a Republican man. It sounds softer coming from a Republican woman because there's just a perception that she's going to have a lot more empathy about the issue, and especially when it comes to children. So even if we're saying the same kind of jerky rhetoric that we do all the time, when you have so many more women candidates being the messengers of that policy, it's going to sound a little bit better and more palatable to voters who it wouldn't have if we were just running the same old Republican men.
That when you look at, people that say that there's an immigration border and don't live at the border, there's a huge a huge disconnect in what they believe are the issues. And so when you talk to people in the Rio Grande Valley at the border, they see things very differently. They, as mentioned, see things as home invasions and things like that as the border issue, not as people running every single day across the border. So we need to make sure that the conversation is really centered around border communities who experience those issues every day and view it very differently than some person in Wisconsin who says that there are migrants coming every single day.
So there's a lot of questions on Zoom that kind of all center around kind of one question that some of the panelists touched on. So I'm going to try to synthesize some of what the Zoom questions are about, which there's a bunch of different questions that sort of name individual issues and sort of say, do you think it's this or that? And so Mike, in your presentation, you mentioned that you think Democrats are stuck in I think you said a social and economic cul-de-sac. And then David, you mentioned that Democrats are just more liberal in general. So, I am curious thinking about some of these folks on Zoom saying, well, is it this issue that they're out of step on or that issue for all the panelists? And then especially David and Mike, since you mentioned this pretty explicitly in your comments, do you think it's just a broad, just Democrats are overall too liberal and that's what's turning off voters in your diagnosis? Or do you think there's particular issues that if you were giving advice to Democrats, as at least one of you does professionally, that you feel like, okay, it's this subset where really tacking to the center would aid the party?
I guess what I'll say is, I think the fact that this happened from 2016 to 2018 is just very important, that this isn't a new thing. This has been happening basically for the last 6 years. And, I think the reason, as other people have said, is because there's been this incredible education polarization. I don't want to say it's necessarily about any particular issue. And I don't even want to say it's about policy in general. But the reality is that there is an enormous cultural gap in values on things like race or gender or policing, or literally every cultural signifier you can imagine. And the reality is that Hispanic voters have more in common culturally with working class white voters than they do with college educated white voters. And what we've seen over the last 8 years is that college educated white voters are much more powerful in the Democratic Party than they were 8 years ago. If you look from 2012 to 2020, Joe Biden got roughly the exact same national 2-way% as Barack Obama. And he did that by doing nearly 20% better with college educated white people and much worse with literally every other group. And so I think that it's I think that's the big thing. Obviously, there's particular policies. It is true that I do want to stress, even though I'm talking a lot about ideology, even Hispanic conservatives are much more moderate or liberal on economic issues than white conservatives are. They tend to be at the very least moderate on these things, but can sometimes be even more conservative socially. But I guess I do want to stress, like, there are these giant gaps in values. If you do want to drill into particular issues, it is true that Hispanic voters are particularly conservative on environmental issues. I'm really glad that was brought up. It comes up in basically every environmental poll I've ever seen. It's true that they're more conservative on crime and public safety. That's like very clear, growing up in Miami. And it's true that on COVID, it's hard to know because I don't really trust 2020 polling, but it does seem like they were more conservative on COVID as well. So if you want to drill down on those particular things, that's fine. But I think it's like a much bigger problem of like college educated white people kind of having like this newfound hegemony over the Democratic Party.
I hate to be the panelist who says, that's exactly right, but that's exactly right. And he's so right. I'm going to expound on it a little bit more. You really have to understand how profound this shift is in American politics between college educated and non-college educated. David said it exactly right. It's literally the values and the two different distinct cultures of these two Americas are at odds with one another. The challenge in the Democratic Party is its entire coalition is made up of wealthier white progressives who increasingly are dominating the party, and the fastest growing segment of the electorate, which it assumed was always going to be part of its base, is decidedly more conservative in both an economic populist sense, as well as an alienation from some of the cultural issues that are being driven. I wrote a piece in the New York Times about this that was saying the defund the police stuff, the open borders stuff, the Latinx dialogue, where white progressives are using this language to define the issues that are of concern to Latinos. And Latinos are just like, I don't even know what you're talking about. All I know is the Democrats are trying to put me out of work because I've got a manufacturing job at the Tesla plant in San Jose, and I want to keep my job and pay the rent. I really don't care what is in your Build Back Better plans. I don't really care whatever your tax credit is. I need to show up and pay the rent on Friday, is essentially what that is. And the solution that Democrats have come up with is just very alien to the experiences of blue collar working class people and the experiences that they have. And I hate to be one of those people that are like, it's the cultural elites, that discussion, but there is so much truth to that. I mean, when I was a kid in the business, back when I had hair and my beard was darker, when you said rich, old, and white, you were talking about Republicans. If you look at the oldest, richest, whitest precincts in America, they're overwhelmingly progressive now. And the reason why is they're focused less on economic concerns and more on cultural issues and cultural concerns. And that is dominant in the Democratic Party. And it's not only dominant, it's institutional. You can't really have any discussions about some of these things because on things like developing a working class agenda doesn't mean giving somebody a $400 tax credit. It means letting me keep my $80,000 a year job in the energy patch in the Rio Grande Valley. And the Democrats cannot go there. They will not go there. And as a result, they're going to continue to lose this battle of values as long as Latinos have lower college education rates and match the values of their non-Hispanic white peers.
Anais, do you want to jump in on this one?
Yeah, I'm going to touch on something that they've talked about, but kind of shift a little bit. The American electorate, as we've seen over the past 10 years, has become increasingly polarized. And when Latinos start to form their political affiliations, they are now going to have to choose a side. And I think that is something that we don't really talk about a lot. We saw in the data, right? They lean moderate because they actually have very different cultural values than those associated in politics in America. They can be highly religious and still, vote Democrat. They can care for the climate, incredible, and they can still vote Republican. They're not aligned the way that American politics wants to assume that they are. And so as the American electorate becomes more polarized, we're going to see that young Latinos are going to have to choose a side because there will no longer be that, moderate person that they can kind of connect with. So I agree with what they're saying, but I also want to add that part to what we should expect to see if we continue on this trend of hyperpolarization.
Great. So I see, so we have the Citron Center for Public Opinion. We have Jack Citron himself in the audience raising his hand. So I can't.
Never take that question.
So I want to ask a question that was stimulated a little bit by the discussion of turnout that was David, I think, brought up. If it is the case, which we know it is the case, that working class voters, less educated voters are less likely to turn out. And if it is the case that those voters are trending Republican, which pretty much everyone here seemed to agree was the case, then why are the Republicans trying to depress turnout instead of increase turnout? It seems completely irrational. I mean, I don't myself think that increasing the number of early voting days has anything to do with democracy, as people seem to go berserk over things like that. But just in a general way, if expanding the electorate means expanding the Hispanic electorate, means expanding the working class electorate, and if those are the groups which, for whatever reason, and you've talked about some of the reasons, are now trending Republican, isn't it? You people are in the business. I just, an old retired person now, so I want to be educated, but it just seems to me that that's, and maybe Amanda, as having worked for a winning Republican, it just seems stupid.
Really did a lot on turnout last year. Exactly to your point, we knew that we had to turn out a lot of folks, and in Virginia, it's a little bit different story than kind of what we're talking about in terms of 2020. Because it's an off year, we were looking at everyone who turned out in 2020 who hadn't turned out in 2017 in the last gubernatorial election. And we really focused a lot of our get out the vote efforts on those voters. And it worked incredibly well. And some of it was talking about how secure elections were to kind of your hardcore Republican voters who thought Donald Trump won Virginia when he lost it by 10 points, which is another conversation for another day. But we talked to them and we kind of encouraged them to come out to vote. Early voting, I agree with you. I don't think it necessarily makes that much of a difference. I actually think it hurts campaigns, not just in terms of Republican campaigns, but one of the biggest shifts that we had in Virginia was during a debate that happened a couple of weeks after voting started. And so if a parent was really upset by Terry McAuliffe saying parents have no business being in their kids' schools, and they had already voted for him, that you can't take that back. So there's still so much of a campaign that happens after early voting starts that just expanding the number of days doesn't necessarily help. But one of the things that does help kind of encourage Republicans to talk to its turnout targets is being able to have that data on the back end, knowing and modeling the electorate and figuring out who the Hispanics are that are likely to move over more towards the Republican, and then focusing our outreach efforts on them. Campaigns, it's a function of time and money, and we have to make sure that kind of our turnout efforts are focused on the right folks in order not to waste either time or money. Which part of it did I not answer?
Why are Republicans trying to discourage people from voting?
I don't think we are. I don't think we are. I mean, we had a better turnout effort in Virginia last year. Actually, the voters that didn't turn out were all Democrats. That was part of the problem. We looked at a lot of the turnout efforts. We were talking to the lower propensity voters and making sure that they were likely to turn out. The campaign, we were just making sure that they were going to be our voters before we told them to turn out. And that's just, I think, good campaign operative work.
Would you want to say something?
Last comment, and then we'll, or
Oh,
from
no.
you two, yeah, and then we'll,
Okay,
that will be at time.
So I just think it's one of the saddest stories in politics that, in 2012, it was basically, as I mentioned, non-voters were much more democratic in the country overall. And this was actually historically very unusual. Like what had happened is that a historic age gap had opened up in the previous 8 years. Racial gaps had also increased to the highest levels seen in the history of American politics, or I don't know, at least since the 30s or something. And but education polarization hadn't happened yet. And so the correlation between not voting and being a Democrat was like very high, higher than it's ever been. And that was very frustrating as a Democratic political operative. But this led to this idea among kind of the activist class or the progressive class that we could radically change the American electorate if we could dramatically increase turnout. And so there, subconsciously at least, was this large scale effort to increase the extent to which people were interested in politics by increasing the salience and social issues. And over the next 8 years, it worked. Turnout did dramatically increase in both the midterms and the generals. But the problem is, it turns out that non-voters, were economically, moderate to liberal, but socially pretty conservative, just because of the correlation between socioeconomic status and social liberalism. And so then, as that happened, as we, liberals got the turnout increase that they wanted, but it was kind of a monkey paw situation where non-voters actually then became a Republican-leaning group. And so it's just kind of a sad story. That was my comment, but.
Let me say that this phenomenon in American history is not new, as we keep saying. It's actually, there's a relatively recent example of a political sea change of non-college educated workers shifting to the Republican Party. We used to call them Reagan Democrats. And there was a virtue in the Republican Party, a pride in getting Democratic votes. But that was when those voters were white. And the nativism in the Republican Party is absolutely undeniable. Okay, I've been in this party for 30 years. I've worked in far more communities on this issue than probably any operative still living today. It is undeniable that what was happening in the 2016 campaign specifically was a direct appeal to anti-Mexican, largely anti-Hispanic sentiment, especially amongst non-college educated white voters, period. End of story. It's like what Paul Ryan said, it's textbook racism, as the Speaker of the House, textbook. So there's a lot of, verbiage going around about why it's not. Now, can that change as the party goes, oh, wait a second, maybe they will vote for us because we've been scared by all of our media outlets into believing that somehow this is going to be an invasion of our country and change things. If they start voting Republican, can that moderate the party? I think in the medium term, it absolutely can, and it will, just because a lot of these people are going to die out. In the short term, you're going to see much more heated rhetoric, especially in Republican primaries, on anti-immigrant sentiment. You're already seeing it in the Ohio primary with J.D. Vance's last one, or the No Way Jose ad from Governor Ivey in Alabama. I mean, just deep, ugly, clear racist appeals in this election cycle happening right now. That is in the short-term future of the Republican Party. The question is going to be, does that become a 20-year brand and harm the party the way it did in California and Arizona? Or can enough Hispanic voters intolerant of that type of overt racism replace those voters fast enough to say there's a better aspirational appeal, like a traditional Reagan optimistic conservatism, that can bring those same voters over and stop that from happening before it destroys itself and rips the country apart?
Great. Well, we're already over time, and I'm also standing between everyone in the room and the reception, including some nice bottles of wine I can see out the door. So with that, I want to just thank our panelists and invite you all to join the reception. I'll also just remind everyone again that we have this event with John Sides on April 29th at 3:30. You can find it on the Citron Center website, and I'm looking forward to talking with you all at the reception.